Hi, I'm Thomas Broadhead. I'm the editor of the Critical Performance edition of the Ives Fourth Symphony. And in this video, I'm going to discuss the instrumentation of the gong part in the symphony and how it was clarified for me not by a conductor or a musician or stagehand or orchestra librarian, but rather by a composer slash musicologist colleague and friend of mine who understands music history extraordinarily well and had an insight into this one thing that had been on my mind from the beginning, but I wasn't sure how to handle. So back in 2012 for the premiere, during the first rehearsal of the fourth movement, a nipple gong was used in the BU, and it sounded awful. The thing reverberates like nobody's business, and it just overwhelms whatever else is sounding at the time. And it just, that kind of rippling, extended rippling that it makes, it was just distracting. And Edfish turned to me and he said, is this what Ives really wanted? And I just thought quickly and I said, okay, I'm going to make an executive decision here for the purposes of this performance. I said, just use a tam-tam. Ives didn't know the distinction. I was right to say what I said, as it turns out, but for the wrong reason. And so here's how I found out that I had actually given the correct advice at that point. Several months later, in January of 2013, I was in Southern California and I met up with my friend and colleague, Stephen Hartke, who at the time was teaching composition at USC. He's now gone on to be the head of the composition department at my alma mater, Oberlin. But we met up to talk about the Ives. He was very interested in the edition, the work I was doing. And I told him the story about the gong part being so awful in the last movement. And part of the reason I had suggested that a tam-tam be substituted was because whenever I had heard it in the past, a tam-tam had always been used. A nipple gong had not been. But the players in Lucerne were being faithful to the instruction in the score, which is, it just says gong, so use a gong, right? And Hartke said, oh, no. The distinction between the tam-tam and the gong was not present in Ives's day. To Ives and everyone of his generation, gong and tam-tam were used interchangeably in reference always to the tam-tam. The first use of a nipple gong was by Puccini in Turandot, which was written in 1924, and it wasn't premiered until 1926. So Ives wouldn't even have heard a nipple gong until the late 20s, and he wrote the Fourth Symphony before that. So he wasn't referencing a nipple gong; he was referencing a tam-tam. And I was like, "Oh, thank you. That's what I needed to know. Okay, that needs to be built into the score." So I made this change. So I added a section on the gongs to the survival guide. And in it, as you can see, I go into the fact that gong and tam-tam were terms that were used interchangeably, always in reference to the tam-tam. And then I go into a further suggestion that Stephen made, which was that a Victorian dinner gong might be a good substitute for the light gong. But then I couldn't just put it there. I needed the percussionist to see it as well. So I added it to the front of the gong part so percussionists can see the note and understand that they're not to use a nipple gong for the tam-tam, also including the bit about perhaps using a dinner gong for the light gong. Now, there was one other issue, though, that came up. And again, Stephen was able to help me with this. In the conductor's note, Ives writes of the light gong may be a small cymbal, hung and fairly taut. Well, what does that mean? I had puzzled over that, and I brought it up to Stephen, and he had an explanation that just made sense right there on the surface. I'm like, oh my goodness, this also must be true. Stephen explained the following to me, and he put it in an email, and his explanation was so clear that I felt it was best just to edit it lightly and to quote it. And he explained that Ives's description of the alternative for the light gong being hung and fairly taut refers to a practice in that day of rigging a cymbal by tying two cords to a hook mounted to a wooden frame passing the cords through the hole in the cymbal and then tightly securing the cords, each to a peg set several inches to either side of the center point of the cymbal, making an inverted Y with the cymbal resting at its crotch. He goes to the trouble to mention this because he does not want players to resort to a small cymbal attached to the shell of a bass drum, which would have a far shorter ride than a true suspended cymbal. Now, I thought this was fantastic because I could imagine what he was talking about. And I said, well, could we cite this in some book? And he said, well, let me look. And then he got back to me. He said, I'm coming up dry. I know I had a book that went into this, and I know I've seen this, but I can't find anything in print to substantiate this. So let me ask some percussionists I know. And so he reached out to Michael Rosen at Oberlin and asked him, and Michael Rosen knew what this was. He said, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. But he didn't have a book that could, document it. And then he put out a call to other percussionists who also assented, but they also were coming up dry as to where you could find something that showed this, either by a picture or by a description. And I did my own research, on various online percussion groups. And again, people knew what this was, but nobody had a book that described it precisely. So I didn't know what to do with this information. It seemed, it has the ring of truth, and people seem to know what this is, but there's nothing in print that substantiates it. That doesn't mean that it was never done. It just means that there's nothing in print that I could find, or anyone I reached out to could find, that could be used in a scholarly fashion. So I chose not to incorporate this into the front matter of the edition. So it's not in the survival guide. It's not in any of the other essays in the front matter. It only exists on the front page of the gong part as a quote by Stephen Harkey as to what might be used for the light gong if you want to substitute a different instrument for it. Let me clarify that Stephen is really one of the most informed composers that I know. He has a vast knowledge of Western music composition and, with great breadth and depth. And he emphasizes to his students that they're not composing in a vacuum. There's a context to the activity that they are performing as they write music. And it's good to understand the context so you can be informed and what you are creating is actually solid. And that mirrors what I was trying to do through this real world feedback that I was getting from everyone, conductors, musicians, stagehands, and even composer musicologists, so that, the edition would not be something that had been created in an editorial vacuum.